a look-through of the sources from the King John saga. Apologies first, this was meant to be a live stream, but the gods of audio technology deemed it not to be so. To begin with, we will look over the physical sources, and then the digital ones, which, if you feel like reading, you can. Links will be in the description with all the sources and links to the author's good read page. Before we start, I just wanted to say thank you for all your support this year, especially to my patrons and YouTube channel members who help fund the channel, enabling me to bring artwork such as this one of King John to life. This image depicts King John towards the end of his reign, where he's lost half of England. You might recognise the artist, Atori. He's drawn images for the likes of History Time, Stefan Milo and The Histocrat. If you'd like to support the channel, you can through Patreon or YouTube channel membership, where you'll receive clemency for skipping ads, as well as behind the scenes stuff, upcoming videos, updates, etc. You can also donate directly using PayPal or Ko-fi. Anyway, enough e-begging, let's move on. So here is a picture of all of the physical sources I have stacked on top of each other, and then on the right hand side are the digital sources, which you can all read online now. So the first book is one of my favourites, a short and sweet book which was recommended by friend of the channel Josh. It is John by Professor Nicholas Vincent, that came out in 2020. And what you'll find on screen is you'll see a short description of it, the price I paid for it, and where I bought it from. So I bought this from Waterstones for $6.99, and it's roughly about 102 pages, offering a biographical account of King John's life. Really enjoyed this book, referenced it a few times as well in the video, because it had some fantastic bits on it. For example, the naming of John, as well as the end description of him, where he talked about him being politically inept and not being able to see the bigger picture. Really enjoyed this book. If you ever get the chance, I would highly suggest buying the book because it's an excellent read, and it's a book that I can see myself just reading again and again, like every few months, just because I really enjoyed the way Nicholas put together the book and the way he described every event in a short detail but in a vivid amount at the same time, with notes on the currency of the time and explaining that it would be rather difficult to try and determine exactly how much money was spent on certain bits of the campaigns that John tried to finance. And a useful resource for when John was in Ireland, as one of the things I found when I was researching King John in Ireland was a lot of these secondary sources came to various different conclusions of how the first expedition went, and I found myself agreeing more with this one over the others, just because of how when I researched the primary sources with Gerald of Wales' account, that's roughly the same conclusion I came to. Next up is Mark Morris's King John, Treachery, Tyranny and the Road to Magna Carta, 2016. Really enjoyed this book. This one is a complete biography of King John from his early days until the end. Mark Morris, big fan of his work. He's done books on the Normans, the Anglo-Saxons, Edward I, and one of the first books I had of his was one of his earliest books called Castles, which was also part of a TV series back in the year 2000. So I would have been like 8 years old, or actually no, 7 years old when it first came out. Again, vivid details, contains a fantastic amount of details about King John, his life, his hobbies, his personality, just everything. It's the complete book, if you want, for King John. He breaks it up into different chapters. Instead of it being from one part of his life to another, it starts in the year 1203 and breaks up through various different parts of King John's reign and his life. So one moment it will jump from, say, 1203 to, say, 1199, etc., etc. But again, really enjoyed this book. Again, really helpful resource as well. Highly recommend buying it. I bought this from World of Books, which is a charity that specialises in books, obviously, for about £6.30. And what I also enjoyed about this particular book was when he referenced primary sources, because the hardest part I have sometimes is getting my hands on the primary sources. So having them referenced in the secondary sources is fantastic and incredibly helpful. The book also has some really good maps of Chateau Gilliard, of England, France, the Angevin Empire, and loads of others as well. So if you ever get the chance, again, I would highly recommend buying this book just for the complete biography of King John. Mark Morris is also on most social medias, and he also offers castle tours around Wales. So you explore some of the castles being led by a professional historian. So well worth it if you do fancy that. Another biographical account, this one by Stephen Church. This one does follow John's timeline from his birth to his death. Again, I'm probably going to say this for most of the books, but I really enjoyed this one as well. This book made me chuckle quite a bit because it referenced just some hilariously dickhead things that King John did, sending crossbowmen to harass the monks at Canterbury, stuff like that. Very funny in some parts, but again gives a nice breakdown of King John's life, what events transpired, as well as a breakdown of certain characters that came into King John's story. So it explains who the Pope was, the power of the Pope at the time, and just references just how vile King John could be sometimes. And again, it also references primary sources like Roger of Wendover. Again, that was really helpful for me as well. The book also offers one of the best conclusions of King John and how his successor, Henry III, managed to secure the throne. So it goes on a little bit after King John's death, as well as mentions how his tomb was built and then how it was defaced by those bloody Victorian bastards. So similar to Mark Morris's book, I bought this from World of Books for £4.30. Now this is a hardback cover, but there is a paperback cover as well, but I prefer the hardback cover because it's just easier to lay out. And same with the previous two books, this book comes to a different conclusion of how the expedition to Ireland went. So again, another helpful resource with plenty of detailed, vivid maps at the start of the book as well, with plenty of place names. It has more place names on the maps. Really, really enjoyed it, as I did all the others. So again, if you ever see it in a local bookshop or online, I would highly recommend buying it. Next up is a biography, but it's not about John. It's about his greatest nemesis, Philip Augustus, King of France. So this is by Jim Bradbury, who sadly passed away at the start of this year. Again, this one was another book I really enjoyed because it was a different perspective, which focused on how Philip developed his court, how he defeated the Angevin Empire, how he finally defeated John, his issues with the papacy. It was a really useful resource for covering the other side and getting information from French sources as well, because the problem I had, again, getting primary sources was the Deeds of King Philip, which is a contemporary source, was only available in French. I don't speak French or read French, so I had to get something else, and this one was the ideal biography for Philip Augustus in English. A really useful resource on the siege of Chateau Gilliard and how Philip conducted his military campaign in 1203 and 1204, which ultimately led to John withdrawing and then focusing the next 8 years to build up towards the Battle of Bouvines, which ultimately lost, as well as the development of France from becoming a really decentralized state to a more centralized state with power under royalty rather than the King of France's power just being confined around Paris and the surrounding areas, because it goes into detail on how he conquered Normandy, the castles he took, and focused on how he specialized in siege warfare, which Philip was exceptionally good at. So this book I bought from, unsurprisingly, World of Books again for £4. However, it's not available on the website anymore, and if you do want a physical copy of this book, it's going to set you back at least £30 now. So it's shot up in price, so just be aware that if you do want to get this book, it's going to be a lot more expensive, unless it reappears on World of Books or any other book site. But at the moment, it's worth a lot more than I paid for it, so just be aware of that. I don't think it's been uploaded to anywhere like Internet Archive, which one of the sources I will talk about in a bit is now. So just be aware of that. Next up, a book you might be familiar with from the last long series, A History of Wales by John Davies. I'm not going to spend too long on this one because I've already covered it last year when we did the history of early Wales. So I bought this one, again, World of Books, £6.30. This book covers pretty much the entire history of Wales from prehistory up until the 20th century. One of my favourite books. Highly recommend it if you ever want to learn about the history of Wales. It's available everywhere. I've seen it on plenty of bookshops for maybe even cheaper. I think there's a hardback copy. There's also a copy in Welsh. England in the 13th century. This is the book that is available online. And as you can see already, I paid £25 for it. But now it's free online at Internet Archive. So if you want to have a read through it yourself, you can. This book covers the classes of the Middle Ages, professional people, the peasants and the land, the contemporary sources, just everything relating to 13th century life. Really useful resource for explaining how life worked in the 13th century and how England was affected by certain factors like the growth of the wool trade during this time, as well as the political developments with Magna Carta, as well as the Second Barons' War as well. So it really goes into really good amount of depth on that time period. I'd highly suggest it if you want to learn about the 13th century in England. I believe it's an old university textbook, so it expects you to know certain phrases and what certain words are. For example, the burgages. There's no description in it to explain what burgages is. So it does require some background learning if you're not familiar with the 13th century. 13th century for me is one of my favourite periods of the Middle Ages because of the growth, the castles, the cathedrals, just everything about it. One chapter goes over the professional people of the Middle Ages, such as sheriffs, knights, estate managers. You could argue most jobs require a certain amount of professionalism. Even if you were a peasant working the land, you still had to know what you were doing with crops, maintenance, etc. If you're like me with poor eyesight and you struggle to look at a screen for a certain amount of time, having a physical copy can help, which is what I prefer. I prefer physical copies over digital ones. But the good thing is it's available free online at Internet Archive. If you want to have a read of it, it's a very useful resource and I'd highly recommend reading it. 1215, the year of Magna Carta. This is a great companion book for England in the 13th century, so I would recommend reading this one first and then going into England in the 13th century. This one summarizes everything about the time period of 1215, so early 13th century and a bit before as well. It breaks it up into several chapters about the life and times, so Englishman's castle, the countryside, town, school, family strife, tournaments and battles, hunting in the forest, the church, King John, the king's men, loads of other ones as well. And then at the end of it, there is the text of the Magna Carta as well. So you'll find some of the books we look over have copies of the Magna Carta. They're their own translated ones. The one I used was translated from the British Library. One of the nice bits I enjoyed reading was the fact that it actually shows some of the stuff that the nobility would have eaten, like geese or swan, really heavy foods to have in the morning or for dinner. The book also explains the type of grain that they would have grown, wheat, rye, that sort of thing, how the land would have been worked, who would have worked it, how it was developed, how towns were developed, like Portsmouth, Liverpool. I really, really enjoyed this book, and I felt a bit of connection to it because at the start of the book, during the introduction, the two authors, Danny Dazinga and John Gillingham, both spoke how when they completed the book, they drove down to Runnymede just to get a sense of it all. And obviously, if you've watched the final King John episode, I drove down to Runnymede, which was horrible. I had to go on the M25, and I don't want to drive anywhere near London. It's just horrible. But I went there. It's near Heathrow, actually, so you'll see a lot of planes go over Runnymede. But I felt a sense of it, of completing a journey, going there to the site where the Magna Carta was sealed. It felt like I was retracing their steps because this came out in 2003. I went down in 2023, so 20 years later. So it was a nice, humbling experience, I found, So again, I bought this from a charity shop for £2, so it was really, really cheap, but my God, it's worth it. If you get the chance, buy it, and I mean, it's a great book and a fantastic read. Magna Carta by Dan Jones. This book summarizes how the Magna Carta was brought into development, as well as the history of the family that created it, the Plantagenets. What I enjoyed about this book was the fact that it went beyond Magna Carta into Henry III's reign and beyond. But one of my favourite aspects of this book was the fact that it went into the men. It gave a short biographical detail of the men who helped make Magna Carta. For example, Stephen Langton, as well as the 25 barons involved in the committee that would arbitrate over King John and persecute him if he broke laws. Of course, none of that happened because as soon as the first Magna Carta was sealed, it was annulled by the Pope and provoked the First Barons' War. It was only after that it became a really important charter, and this book seeks to cover that. Nice cover, really, really nice cover. I know we don't judge books by their cover, but this one is a really nice cover. Bought this again from a charity shop for £3.50. I didn't use this book as much as the others, partly because the next book I cover kind of succeeded it in terms of the scope of the amount of information in it, but I did enjoy this book because it gave a nice summary of everything relating to Magna Carta and featured mathematical works of how certain things would have worked, like inflation, the tally sticks they would have used, keep records, and stuff like that. Dan Jones also does so many other things now. He's really broken the mold in terms of what historians actually do, but he did a series on the Plantagenets called The Bloodiest Crown, which I believe you can still watch on Netflix. So I'd recommend that because that goes into a nice vivid detail of how dramatic it was, and the actors that portray the characters of the Plantagenets, really solid, really good, and it goes up to King Richard III. Magna Carta, Origins and Legacy by Professor Nicholas Vincent. If you want the complete guide to Magna Carta, how it impacted history, including the US and other nations around the world, this is the book to have. It is a phenomenal book that is a lot of information. It's a huge book and just goes to show you the passion and love for the Magna Carta that Professor Nicholas Vincent has. This book was phenomenally helpful in terms of getting to the political grips of the Magna Carta, and it explained it in a way that was so clear to me. This is probably why I enjoyed Nicholas's books over the others, because I just felt I connected and resonated with them more so than any of the others. It's filled with some lovely images as well, which explain and give context to the things he's talking about in the book. I would highly recommend it if you are really interested in the Magna Carta. If you start with Dan Jones's book first and then move on to this one is the ideal book to have. Again, it was slightly more expensive, £11.80, but it was well worth it, and it was an even greater resource than I could have imagined, as we tend to underestimate how much of an impact Magna Carta had and how important it would be for us in our time. While it's obviously a redundant charter now, it's such an important one for the history of how we get toward a modern democracy today. The book also covers the amount of copies of the Magna Carta, what happened to them, where they've ended up. One thing I forgot to mention with Professor Nicholas Vincent is he's working towards a goal of having everything from the Angevin kings relating to Magna Carta published online, so there'll be a link to that webpage as well, which goes over the details of that. The Oxford Illustrated History of Ireland by R.F. Foster. This is the oldest physical source I have, 1989. When I started to look into King John in Ireland, I wanted an Irish source written by an Irish author, and I really enjoyed the poignant remark on how the political unity of Ireland was nearly done, but then it was unravelled with the Anglo-Normans coming to Ireland. If I ever cover any more history of medieval Ireland, which I would like to, this is one source I'm definitely going to be using again. It was rich with history. Really enjoyed the way he explained it. It was very easy to follow, because I find Ireland is so unique compared to Britain and the rest of Europe from late antiquity up to the high Middle Ages. It's just the fact that it's pretty much left on its own until obviously the arrival of the Vikings. but before that, the history of it, and then even after the Vikings, the history of Ireland then, before the arrival of the Anglo-Normans. So it was a really interesting book to get some research on, and again, I really enjoyed it. I purchased it from a charity shop. I haven't checked to see if it's available online. It might be, because it's quite an old book now, so it might be on Internet Archive. I haven't really looked. I really did enjoy the history of the High Kings of Ireland and the Hill of Tara and all the other stuff relating to that. My friend Charles has a video on the Druids in Ireland, so if you want to learn more, I would recommend that video. Fantastic one, and yours truly made some maps for that video, so it's definitely worth a watch now. Well, that's all of the physical sources done. I'm just going to quickly go over some of my favourite maps and images that I made for this series, and then we'll move on to the digital sources. So the first map is perhaps the one that took me the longest amount of time to draw, and that is Chateau Gilliard. The hard part for making this map was to try and show it on a cliff to show how high it up was, because the software I use, Wonderdraft, that's one of its weaknesses, is it's a bit hard to show cliff facings. But I think I've done a good job of it. The only other thing is that the assets I use, the wall, if we just zoom in on it, it shouldn't have that many towers around it, but that's because the software I was using, they didn't have any of the other flat walls as you can see here. But no, I'm really, really happy with it, actually. I think it's quite a good castle, and hopefully it fits the theme of what I was going for. Next up is an image of the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV, which I made up in, again, Wonderdraft. This image features his seal on the left-hand side and the heraldry flag, or crest, on the right-hand side. I'm really happy with this. And the reason I did it like this is some of the images that are CC, copyright free, the quality and the resolution of them isn't the greatest, but being able to bring them into Wonderdraft and fix them up there just makes them look a bit better, especially for a YouTube video where you really have to pay attention to resolution sizes. So this is my way of doing character introductions, because obviously sometimes new characters come in and I need to explain who they are or something they've done so they fit in with the story, and this is just one way of showing that. This next one is Portsmouth, where King John set up his first expedition to go into France, where it failed. This one was relatively easy to draw. Portsmouth has got quite a distinctive shape to it at this time period. So what I did here was I tried to find the oldest map of Portsmouth, which I think was from 1550, and I basically just changed the scale so it would be more medieval. And one thing you'll notice in my maps, if you're familiar with the Middle Ages, is that every day in my maps is market day. So market day obviously didn't happen every day. I just like to depict market day in my maps because I like it. And then if you notice on some of the maps, there's a mermaid hidden on them. So if you can find them, well done to you. Next up, we have one of my favourite Irish cities, Dublin. This one I based off an earlier map from around the 1300s. As you can see, there is no Dublin Castle yet because this is Dublin in about 1190. Dublin Castle was ordered to be constructed by King John in 1204. So if I do update this map to that period, I'll throw in the castle in the east side of the city. The hardest part of drawing this map was just making sure that the river placement was correct and how it folds into it. Again, quite proud of this map. I wish I could have used it more, which again, if I do any more Irish history and it involves Dublin, I will be definitely showing off this map again because I think it's a lovely map. And the final image is of Robert the Pious, King of the Franks, being informed that him and his lover have been excommunicated. I needed something funny for the achievement of John becoming the first King of England to be excommunicated. I saw this image, I thought it was brilliant, I loved the details on it, and I thought let's make a joke out of it by putting an achievement on there. In the spirit of Crusader Kings or Europa Universalis, become excommunicated before 1520. I thought it was just a funny little gag to put in. I like to make jokes. And now finally, the digital sources, which I want all of you to go and read. That's right, you're going to go and read them, and I want a 5,000 word essay on them sent to me at my email address, embracehistoria@gmail.com. I want it by the end of the year, otherwise you aren't allowed to stay up until midnight to celebrate the new year. That's right, I've done a 180 on you. I'm not the one doing the research now, it's your turn to do it. I've done it enough now, I've spent 11 months doing this, okay? And I'm already working on the next project because I'm an absolute idiot who can't seem to take time off from this because I enjoy it so much. But I will be taking a wee break in January because it's January and I've got a lot of catching up to do in terms of video games, so yeah. But if you enjoyed this video, if you could like and subscribe if you're not already, and then share the video, as well as leave me a comment. I promise I will look at the comments for at least 3 days before I start on the alcohol. I've got 2 more videos I'm going to try and release before the end of the month, so I will see you then. Bye.